the Westminster bubble is more than a mere metaphorical representation. It also exists geographically.
The next station is Westminster. Change for the Jubilee line. Exit for Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament and riverboat services from Westminster Pier. Mind the gap between the train and the platform.
A large number of think tanks, that is, groups of policy researchers and campaigners, are clustered close to Parliament and the civil service.
Mind the gap, please.
Mind the gap between the train and the platform. This is Westminster.
Mind the gap, please.
The Adam Smith Institute, a neoliberal think tank, sits around the corner from the Department for Business and Innovation, which is responsible for the industrial strategy. It is also opposite the Department for Education. I spoke to Sam Dumitriu, head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. I started by asking him what he thought the main differences between classical liberalism and neoliberalism are.
Well, I think labels are always tricky because you always have broad churches. I mean, some people who call themselves classically liberal probably agree with us on 99% of things. Same with libertarian. I think in general we don't use the term libertarian because it's used too much by sort of real purists who sort of say, there's a libertarian article once called Milton Friedman was a socialist. I don't think that makes sense, and I think that sort of rigid ideology really work out very well. In terms of classical liberals, I think one of the problems is a lot of people who describe themselves as classical liberal don't seem to be truly committed to a lot of the key things about liberalism, which I think involves an openness to migration as well. And I think in generally the reason we call ourselves neoliberals, you have some people who are, pro foreigner, pro big state, anti-market. You have some people who are anti-foreigner, pro-market, anti-state. But you don't really have anyone who's pro-market, anti-state, pro-foreigner. And I think that is quite an interesting sort of dichotomy there, or trichotomy even. And I think that's where we sort of fit in. I think we're very comfortable with the modern world and sort of the direction it's gone over the past 40 years. I mean, the gradual embrace of markets has lifted a lot of people out of poverty. It's really changed things for the better. And I think a lot of what neoliberalism is about is making similar cases to classical liberals or libertarians, but also making it in a more empirical and a more outcome-focused way. I mean, we argue for freedom not just because it's good in itself. Whether or not you agree with that, it's sort of irrelevant to us, but we argue that it delivers positive outcomes, the sort of outcomes people want.
Would you agree that neoliberalism has gone slightly astray since it first, it was more introduced in the 1980s, 1990s, so for example, housing?
I'd say on some areas we are more neoliberal now than we've ever been, but on a lot of areas I think we haven't had enough free markets. To me, the key area is housing, where planning regulations prevent a lot of development. That has significantly pushed up the price of housing. When I say the price of housing, I don't just mean house prices, but I also mean rents as well, and the cost of servicing mortgages and at the same time buying a house. And I think that's the key metric on that, by the way. So I think on that sense, there's a lot of scope there. And also things like rail privatisation, for instance, has been very successful if you look at just passenger numbers. But over time, while we don't have state control, we do have over-regulation and the state very much specifying to a really sort of minuscule detail of how train companies should run. So we don't actually have as much privatisation and competition as I'd like. So I think, we can probably push into a more neoliberal direction on utilities. I think the key area, though, has to be housing.
The next station is St James's Park.
A little further out in Petite France is a left-leaning Fabian society. Here I met senior researcher Jason Brock. I asked him, what is unique about Fabianism?
So Fabianism is, well, we're the only think tank to have our own kind of descriptor in that kind of way, which we're very proud of. Obviously a very long-standing think tank, established 1884, so the longest lived political think tank in Britain, if not the world. We've always emphasised gradualism, a sort of desire to create radical and permanent change through gradual, progressive, evolutionary means. So we seek to be able to maintain, I suppose, a kind of stable society whilst we try and move forward towards a more social democratic future. So that's how I would distinguish our brand, as it were.
And what has the left learned about previous attempts at social democracy, socialism?
Well, quite a lot, I think. I mean, so the history of kind of social democracy in Britain is obviously, it's a long one. It's a very complicated one. If we go back to the very first Labour government in 1924, Ramsay MacDonald, minority administration, often forgotten about, lasted less than a year and it achieved very little in terms of a social democratic or socialist programme. But what it demonstrated, I think, then was that Labour as a party was fit to govern. And of course, Ramsay MacDonald himself returned to office in 1929, lasting until 1931, was ultimately brought down that government, at least by discussions around leaving the gold standard in that year. And then, of course, it's 1945 when we tend to date, Labour's most kind of fantastic electoral success to that point, and the Attlee governments in that year, and then again in 1950 to 51. And the achievements that they made were, I think, extraordinary. I mean, it shaped modern Britain, continues to shape it today. We talk about the NHS, and of course, today is in fact the kind of the week of its birthday, the day after its birthday, those 70 years ago. So completely changed the shape of Britain. But I mean, social democracy in Britain as well, we shouldn't think of it necessarily as an aberration. It's part of a broader European story in particular, and we can see the development of large kind of welfare states elsewhere in Europe at the same time. So I think one of the particular things about British social democracy is that we maybe shouldn't always think about British social democracy. We should think about it in the context of European social democracy. I think what we have seen, if we look at all the Labour governments to date, is that implementing radical change is quite a challenging thing to achieve. We can see that some of the new policies that we introduced, some of the changes to the structure of the British economy, nationalisation of industries, the welfare state itself even, were not always things that remained stable forevermore, but nor should we expect them to be. I suppose, for me personally anyway, what I've learned about social democracy through studying history is that it has to change with the times. We have to be able to read what is in front of us, read the challenges that are before us, and rethink some of the suppositions that we have. One might say, for example, in a world where we see fast-paced technological change causing enormous disruption to the way that people work and will become even more disruptive over time, old sort of notions perhaps of kind of nationalisation of the economy are less appropriate. In some sectors, yes, transport maybe, but in some areas we need to think much more creatively, probably think more about kind of cooperative economics, think more about employee participation, for example. It doesn't make it not social democracy. If social democracy is anything at all, it's a commitment to social justice. And of course, how we might define that and how we might seek to achieve that is going to be different from era to era. So that's what I've learned, anyway.
How do you move from the current system to a neoliberal system without shifting too much power away from homeowners, renters, etc.?
Well, I think first you have to think why we have planning regulations, and they tend to be that there's a lot of externalities in land markets.
An externality for the purpose of this discussion is an effect on others that is not accounted for in the prices of goods and services produced, and as such does not create a deterrent to stop or an incentive to continue for the party creating the externality. These can be either positive or negative.
So one example would be, you don't want someone building a factory next to your semi-detached house. That probably wouldn't be good because they would end up polluting on you. Maybe you could settle that dispute legally, but those transaction costs are typically quite high. And certain developers can lower other property prices. So I can understand why people want some regulation. But the problem is the regulation isn't just designed to protect property prices from, spillover effects, not where one house makes another house less valuable. Not just because there's more houses available and they're cheaper, but because, they're an eyesore, or, they're polluting, or, they're creating noise or something like that. I think you have to move to a system where development is more the norm, and the process is only blocking development when it's absolutely necessary. I think Japan have a good zoning system. So in Japan, they don't have what's called exclusive use zoning. So in a lot of America, when something's zoned for residential, you can't bring commercial uses or industrial uses. But at the same time, when it's zoned for industrial or commercial, you can't bring in residential. I don't think that makes that much sense. I think you want a system ideally where you should be allowed to be up to the maximum nuisance on your street. And once you set what the maximum is, you give people a lot of flexibility to build, and a lot more certainty as well. And I think that's probably the ultimate direction you'd want to go in. But there are lots of transitionary steps that we could take. There's a lot of land near train stations within London that could be released for development, but it's currently on the green belt, so development is effectively blocked. By making a rule, say, if you're within 10 minutes walk of a train station that's 3/4 of an hour journey time to central London, then all of a sudden you can unlock a lot of housing without building on green spaces or interacting, adding in, making areas less desirable. In fact, I think in a lot of cases you'd make the area more desirable. And I think a good example is there's lots of garages and dirt tracks and sort of gas stations and all these sort of things that currently are classified on greenbelt land that in their current state aren't providing green space. But if you allowed development, people potentially would have a large garden on it, so you would actually be adding green space in those cases. And I think that should be what we start doing. But I also think we need to make it easier to build up within cities, allowing people to add 2-3 stories extra by right, allowing people to build up to the highest building in their road. I think those sort of things would help. Also making a lot of the aspects of the system more rational. So our height limits aren't really defined by geometrical things, because the reason you want fewer tall buildings is because they put shade on people, they block out natural light. But in Japan, they have a very rational system. The wider the street, the taller the buildings can be because there's less light blockage. In the UK, it's very arbitrary. There's not really a systematic rule, or if there is a rule, it's not enforced.
Apart from childcare, housing and transport seem to be two of the largest costs currently. How can that be addressed, and how did that happen? How did the costs of housing and transport increase in the first place?
Do you mean the costs to the government, the costs to the individuals? Well, let's talk about housing in the first instance. I think the problem with housing is very simple, very fundamental. We don't build enough houses. We have fallen far below historic levels of house building. And when one does that, of course, the demand and supply equilibrium is very much upset. And as a result, prices rise. Now, the other issue here is, of course, it creates an incentive for certain economic actors to maintain a kind of restriction of supply. And we see even with big housing developers that they wish to build only at a rate that will maintain house prices. This is how their profitability is driven. Simple examples of that often are things like when we look at a particular, say, a large-scale housing development, 200, 300, 400 homes, whatever it might be, the developer often drips those homes onto the market to avoid flooding the local market in order to keep the house price up. Now, I'm not saying there's necessarily anything corrupt about those practices at all. But if we are serious about tackling the housing crisis in Britain, it's clear that we have to build more homes. How we do that is always going to be politically contentious. For my part, I would like to see a lot more council homes, a lot more social housing. I think that's essential. I think that's the way that we're going to tackle those who are the most vulnerable in society and allow them the best chance to succeed. But we also, I think, need to think about where we are building homes. At the moment, we tend to build as much as we can around the fringes of urban developments, which creates greater and greater kind of urban intensification, which brings with it its own challenges, including on the transport system, as we'll come back to. But perhaps we need to think about whether we might build a bit more on green space and green belt in order to address the crisis. But we can't obviously just plonk homes anywhere. They have to be linked in with proper infrastructure, or we'll create economic problems as a result. If people can't easily get to work, or if there aren't a lot of workplaces where they find their home, then clearly the housing is not going to be of good quality, is not going to be conducive to a good quality of life for residents. So I think we need to think much more kind of boldly in some of those ways. We probably also have to think in urban areas about intensification in terms of going upwards as well. I mean, Britain has traditionally been fairly resistant to high-rise buildings, for example. They've been associated with kind of quote-unquote failed social housing projects. But in fact, we can see in certain areas, cities, London, the most obvious example, but other big cities, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow even, increases in kind of high-rise living, but these are often at the luxury end of the spectrum. I think we need to think much more about how we can build more intensively in urban areas and build homes that people think are good quality and that they are satisfied with, that they want to live in. There are all sorts of policy changes that are required in terms of affordable housing contributions as well. At the moment, it's far, far too easy for a housing developer at the planning stage to avoid full social housing contributions by saying that it would make the project unviable economically. Now, the way that viability is assessed is problematic in and of itself, but there has to be some review of those kinds of policies. In terms of transport, Britain has a kind of creaking transport infrastructure. There has been insufficient investment for far too long. The railways are most obviously highlighted in this way. And in fact, it's curious because, in recent years, the railways have experienced a great renaissance in terms of passenger numbers. There's been some considerable investment in elements of the infrastructure, but this has often been implemented poorly. If we look at the Great Western Main Line, for example, its electrification program is many years overdue, it is massively over budget, and now we see that it is to be curtailed. So we won't even have the full benefits of that electrification program. It will stop short of the full realisation. And I think Britain has to be much bolder in terms of that kind of rail infrastructure, and it has to get much better at delivering it as well. Clearly has to be some improvements in terms of Network Rail's delivery and its working with partners. But even if we look beyond the railways, we have kind of road networks that are not often fit for purpose. They require additional capacity. But there's almost a kind of vicious cycle there as well. If we expand a motorway, we tend to find that the desire to utilise that motorway increases proportionately. Once you increase that kind of that road infrastructure, more demand suddenly emerges to fill it. So I think Britain's future in terms of transport and in terms of how we can improve has to be more public transport orientated. We have to think much more about how we can develop good and impressive rail systems, how we can make sure that capacity is increased at the same time as passenger comfort. We need to subsidise fares. They are becoming higher and higher, and there's a great risk now, and it's already happening in many areas, where people are priced out of the transport network. They are unable to use it in the way that they should be able to. They're unable to afford to get to work at the right time. So we need to look at the fare structure. We need to look at how we subsidise fares. We need to think much more about buses as well. Labour have announced a series of policies quite recently about free bus passes for the under 25s, for example. which I think is a great policy, incredibly interesting. But it's clear that in order to make that really work in terms of people being able to use public transport buses to its full potential, we have to have investment in those networks as well. It's, to my mind, I think it's probably time to think about the restoration of municipal control or greater municipal regulation of the bus network. It's the kind of thing that we see, of course, in London, but there are other towns and cities across the country where their bus network or their kind of local authority bus company was never privatised, never sold off. Examples of Reading, Nottingham, for example, that regularly come top in terms of assessments of bus quality in the UK, and so there's something to be said for that kind of model, and I think we have to think much more creatively in that way. It's quite possible that new technology unlocks new demand centric and demand responsive, I should say, ways of using public transport as well. Lots of companies have been experimenting as to kind of whether they can use apps on phones to create different transport networks, different transport routes that are much better at adapting to demand at a given moment, reducing the cost of the operator but delivering a better service for the passenger. And so some of we should, I think, as a country, think about supporting some of those startups, think about what regulatory frameworks are required, because at the moment establishing a demand responsive bus company is incredibly difficult because of the regulations around establishing a bus route. And I think we have to at least create some easements. One wouldn't want a kind of completely deregulated marketplace where things could go horrifically wrong, but at least think about easing some of the restrictions to make it easier for these companies to experiment with new ways of delivering transport.
Okay. Obviously, freedom of the markets allows quite a flexible labour force.
Yeah.
What can we do about in areas that are left behind by this flexibility in labour force, by changes in industry?
Well, I think there is a case for sort of social insurance, having a welfare system that makes it so that people don't feel like they're going to lose out when you have these big technological changes. But at the same time, I think in general these changes do seem to benefit a lot of people, and I don't think we've seen sort of the hit to employment that we would have thought. I'll give you an example. Like we've seen factories close, we've seen the high street completely reorganised, but we also have record levels of employment. So overall, jobs aren't being destroyed. I think part of it is getting the monetary conditions right, sensible central bank policy, but I also think part of it is just making it so that people don't have an incentive to save their company or whatever, too much of an incentive anyway. I think people will always have an incentive, and I think one of the things you see in America, where you've had the China shock, where essentially China enters the global market, a lot more import competition. The US welfare system isn't very well designed to get people back into work, and it's not very generous either. So as a result, people are much more likely to object to new developments or free trade or new deregulations. I think it's trying to make that system work and give people more of a stake if they win out. And I think generally flexibility in the labour market is a good thing, and I think it gives people much more freedom to plan their life around work or vice versa. And I think in general flexibility makes it less likely that people will be left behind, because they'll have more job opportunities. I mean, there are certain cases, for instance, Uber, obviously existing black cab drivers are being left behind, but let's face it, they were earning essentially monopoly profits against consumers for a long time before that happened.
Great. You talked earlier about social justice. How does one balance the need for individual merit and sort of fixing demographic inequality? So, for example, affirmative action would be an example in the United States.
Yeah, so I think sometimes we misunderstand terms that we use. So we often talk about equality of opportunity, for example. I agree with the principle that people are trying to espouse, but actually, in some ways, it's problematic because, let's say, a lottery is perfect equality of opportunity. We could determine who goes into whatever occupation, whatever career, whatever university, whatever school by a lottery, and this is perfect equality of opportunity. But it's not really necessarily the kind of society that we might desire. So we should think much more about luck, egalitarianism, I think, trying to eliminate those things which are down to some sort of established interest. So, somebody should not have an advantage in life because their parents were wealthy, and somebody should not have a disadvantage in life because their parents were poor. We have to be able to adjust for these things, and this is what I call kind of luck egalitarianism. So we want a society, of course, where individual merit is part of what kind of drives us forward, but we also have to be able to address some of those entrenched disadvantages that certain groups suffer from. So kind of affirmative action, as they call it in the United States, or sort of positive discrimination, as it's sometimes called, seems to me an incredibly sensible idea. Now, it isn't something, I think, that we might want in our utopia. If we were to envisage the society that we want, it's probably not one where we have to have positive discrimination, affirmative action, but because we no longer need it. And so, actually, if someone were to imagine themselves let's say, working in a company dominated by white male kind of employees, and you receive, you're recruiting for a job, and you receive all of your applications, and you choose those who you wish to interview. You may have some processes in place to ensure that you have a good diversity of candidates at the interview stage, for example. But because you've been working in an environment like that for so long, on an almost subconscious level, you may have come to associate kind of the right kind of person with the kind of person that's already dominant in that corporation, in that company. And so actually giving people a greater opportunity, say women or ethnic minorities, is not an unfair advantage, but it's actually an essential advantage in order to address some of those structural issues, institutionalized issues that exist in the world. And we have to be sensible about how we implement those things, and we have to think what is the best way to do it. And there are plenty of people who are far more expert in this area than I, but I think actually things like guaranteed interview schemes for candidates who meet certain criteria where the company maybe is not otherwise well represented are a good principle to have. And I think we need to have a degree of kind of training and engagement in society at large about what diversity is. I mean, it's often kind of thrown about as a word without really being considered, and there's plenty of evidence, of course, that suggests that more diverse companies, more diverse businesses are in fact also more successful businesses. So it seems to make rational economic sense to diversify the workforce, let alone the social benefits which are imperative.
Great. You talked before, the Adam Smith Institute has talked before about the negative income tax, actually following Norton Friedman, and also potential for universal income.
Yeah.
What are the different pros and cons of each?
Well, negative income tax and basic income are effectively the same policy. The difference is how you claw back that basic income. Do you claw it back with higher tax rates at the top, or do you claw it back more gradually with income? Negative income tax has a much more gradual way of doing it, but in practice they should have roughly similar effects. You'd expect the basic income to have lower bureaucracy costs, but again, the way you claw it back will create bureaucracy. So I think they're relatively equal as policies. I think negative income tax, because on paper, for instance, when people look at the budget, taxes and spending will appear lower, so I think that has a bigger chance of succeeding, but they're effectively the same policy. I don't think there's that much likelihood of happening anytime soon, but I think one of the good things about the negative income tax is it makes work pay. So I think policies like working tax credits or the earned income tax credit in the US are very effective policies. And I think if you look at the decision in 2015 to cut working tax credit and raise the living wage, I think that was the exact opposite of what you'd want to do, because one of those leads to lower levels of employment, while the other leads to higher levels of employment. But they're both ways of redistributing money from rich people to poor people. But the living wage does it in a very inefficient way. You know, it redistributes from low-wage employers to low-wage people. It doesn't redistribute from high-wage employers to low-wage people. Or earned income tax credit, redistributes progressively, because, the tax system itself is progressive. And it gives it directly to the people you want to help. Things with minimum wage, for instance, it ends up giving it to people who not only people who are relatively in need, but also the children of wealthy people who are working minimum wage jobs while over the summer holidays or things like that. Obviously, the living wage only applies when you're 25, but it doesn't target the people you'd want to help very well.
The current working tax credit system, how can that be changed in order to...
Well, I think it's making it less sort of specific on family circumstances, make it easier for single people to claim it even if they don't have children, making the bureaucracy just lower, so it's much easier to claim, much more. And essentially when you have your normal tax return, you can be automatically signed up for it. That would be one way of helping it along. I think the way they do it in the US is pretty effective, but again, for couples that's very effective policy reduction tool. But you also need to look at single people, and I think a lot of the other tax credits or cash benefits could be rolled into a bigger employment tax credit. I think something like housing benefit would be much better if it was direct money, rather than money ring-fenced for housing. I think that would lead people probably would spend less money on housing and more money on other things, but at the moment they're only going to spend money on housing because that's what the money's there for and that's the only way they can get it.
Okay. How do you ensure that working tax credit doesn't subsidise inefficient companies, inefficient industries?
Well, I mean, the working tax credit effectively is a tax credit for hiring people. So it lowers the cost of labour, but it also reduces inefficiencies in the first place, because the existing welfare system creates a big disincentive for hiring workers, because you have such a generous welfare. You have a relative, well, not such a, but you have welfare benefits, and that the clawback rate is quite fast on that. So I think that's a problem you'd want to solve. And I think that's what working tax credit solves. So it makes the benefit from going into work much bigger than it otherwise would be if there was only an unemployment benefit system. I think in general, even if you're subsidising large inefficient employers, provided you have a level of competition, you'd expect that money to eventually be chased out of the inefficient employers. If you think it is subsidising bad employers, then I think ultimately that money is going to either be driven out, or you need to look at competition policy. Where's competition? Is there not enough competition? And is that why people aren't? Is that why firms that are inefficient aren't going out of business? Because that's what you expect. If you're only able to turn 2% profit and I'm able to turn 5% profit, you'd expect interest rates to be pushed up, and the cost of borrowing for the struggling firm might push them under.
For example, social care, there's certain industries that are non-scalable, difficult to raise the productivity. How does one increase the pay if you can't raise productivity? Or if you can, is there a way of raising the productivity in these low-paid areas?
Enormously challenging. I was at a small conference in Berlin earlier this week, And a very interesting point was raised, actually, which is, well, perhaps it's time for us to start rethinking how we measure productivity, because under existing ways of measuring productivity, a healthcare worker, a social care worker, will never be as productive as someone working in a factory, for example, manufacturing. So maybe it's time for us to rethink how we kind of understand productivity. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I think we really should do, and especially as the nature of the economy is changing. And these things are, seem to occur once every kind of 40 years or so, and what we kind of an economist called Eric Dahmen used to call development blocks. And I think we're at the sort of start of a very important and very unusual development block where actually so many aspects of the structure of our economy are going to change fundamentally. But it's also, social care is a kind of very peculiar sector of the UK economy. It is very underfunded, even with new funding having been announced for the NHS recently. No new funding was announced for social care. The funding for it often comes out of local authority coffers, and I've already said how depleted they are, and local authorities don't have the flexibility to create new money in the area very easily. It is interesting as well that in some areas, so the southeast as a region, the amount of people employed in the social care sector over the last 5 years has remained constant, but the number of social care workers has increased. So we can see that what social care kind of operators seem to be doing is cutting back on some of the administrative costs, maybe kind of removing some of the admin workers that they have and increasing the number of social care workers. So there's something very interesting going on in that sector that needs to be looked at. Increasing pay there is obviously incredibly challenging, and I think it's one of those sectors where people have benefited more so from rises in the minimum wage than perhaps some other sectors, although we could say the same for leisure, hospitality, food and drinks and so on as well. I think we need to think as a country, have a national conversation about what we want our social care system to look like, how it should be integrated with the NHS, whether it should be something left to individual local councils, unitary authorities or county councils, or whether it's something where we might want to think about collaboration between councils, maybe on a formalised basis, kind of regional structures. But we have to change something because it's clearly incredibly problematic. It is clearly creaking, and it is clearly an enormous issue as we have an aging kind of population. As the kind of baby boomer generation moves into retirement, there will be greater and greater pressure on social care mechanisms. Beyond that, I think we sometimes talk about it as a sector where automation, for example, is not such a challenge, but actually artificial intelligence, sort of machine learning, the use of big data to make processes kind of more efficient and actually in some ways kind of more human, better responsive to the needs of individuals, offers some opportunities for social care. It's difficult to maybe foresee exactly what they will look like, but I think there has to be a kind of some sort of almost social care laboratory, a bit of money made available in order to allow experiments in terms of better ways of delivering social care, better ways of delivering services by using big data, by using artificial intelligence. I know that some local authorities have actually experimented very directly with things like robotics. I think it was Southend in particular that have done some of this. I don't think that's the future of social care, and if it is, it sounds slightly menacing, probably sounds more menacing than it should be, but I do think there's something to be said for thinking through new technologies which might deliver ways of increasing productivity in social care. But fundamentally, it's probably actually a conversation we have to have about what is productivity and what does productivity mean, particularly in the health and social care sector.
A lot's been talked about the idea of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, machine learning. How can we accelerate the process? How the gap between?
Well, I think the key thing is not to slow it down. So don't get in the way with pointless regulations. I think we might have reached the point where we're worrying too much about the ethics of automation and the ethics of AR, and not enough about actually delivering it. The EU recently published a document saying that they would like to be the world leader in reflecting on the issues of artificial intelligence. China and the US want to be world leaders in artificial intelligence. I think that's the right attitude to take, and I think it's to ensure that doomsday scenarios aren't what we base policy on. We should be proactionary, not precautionary. And I think a lot of the time people sort of be too risk averse, and that can slow down the adoption of new tech. In particular, I think also the public need to be better informed. So I think one issue with GM is the public were very poorly informed on the issue. The media, I think, was quite misleading about the issues with GM. And as a result, we didn't get GM crops in the UK, and they're banned across the EU. I think learning from that experience and making the case, making sure that doomsday scenarios or sort of outlandish scenarios aren't centre grounded, I think it's probably the most effective thing we can do at the moment. And I think there are some issues, for instance, the idea of AI contributing to discrimination. I think that's more a risk within the public sector rather than the private sector. Generally, algorithms within the private sector tend to be accurate, or they tend to at least be trying to be as accurate as possible. Because if your algorithm isn't accurate, then potentially your rival's algorithm that's more accurate will bid away clients. In the public sector, you don't have that kind of profit and loss mentality, so you can have bad systems persist because the good systems won't go out of business, won't drive the bad systems out of business, which is what happens in the private sector.
Okay. And regulation sometimes has a tendency to build upon itself and be expanded. How does the free market envision dealing with externalities without too much of that regulation growth?
Well, generally, externalities I think is an appropriate place to intervene, but I think in a lot of cases, for instance, we do it in a very inefficient way. So take the environment. We have all these sort of targets, many market interventions to stop climate change. We would be much better off, instead of all this regulation, just to have a simple carbon tax levied on, polluting fuels, agriculture, things like that, where we know they're emitting a lot. Then once those true costs are realised, people could decide whether they're willing to pay that extra cost or whether they're willing to, switch to less polluting products or reduce their energy. And I think using that decentralised wisdom of the market is the solution. But I think at the moment we regulate very specifically, so I think moving to more of an outcome-based approach is better. It's tricky on the on some externalities where it's a very marginal thing. You don't want to set up a new tax system. You probably don't have the capacity to set up a new do it by lawsuit or whatever. So there might be some cases for regulation. But I think submitting those regulations to cost-benefit analysis and getting rid of them if they don't meet that cost-benefit analysis is a good way of doing it. But in general, where possible, we should use the price mechanism.
Great. The economy, there's quite a broad problem with productivity in the economy. One of the problems with that is capital deepening, a lack of capital investment. What underlies that and how can it be improved?
Well, it's a very, very difficult issue, and productivity growth in Britain hasn't recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, and a lot of economists have spilt a lot of ink trying to think through why this might be. Now, it is clear that there is underinvestment in new technologies and new infrastructure in the UK, and this operates both on the national level. We've already spoken a bit about the lack of investment in infrastructure, and that has a great effect on productivity actually. If people are having to travel to work and it takes them longer to get there and so on, then they are likely to be less rested, less productive, less happy as a result, and happiness and productivity inherently linked. But also on the firm level, there are a lot of firms that have put off investing in new technologies, or they've deferred those decisions. Now, there may be all sorts of reasons for that. I think at the immediately present time, a lot of that is to do with uncertainty about Brexit and the economic dislocation that might come with leaving the EU, and an uncertainty about what kind of deal Britain will have afterwards. But that kind of deferment of investment has been going for a longer period as well. It could be that effectively firms are finding labour rather cheaply. And it's certainly interesting that when we look at the growth of employment, and we know that employment in the UK is high, the economic indicator in that way is positive, yet GDP and productivity are not raising in the way that we would expect them to do. But when we look at where employment has grown, it is often in less productive industries, in food and drink, hospitality, tourism sectors. And so it might be that in many cases, actually, it's been a lot easier for a firm, let's say in the hospitality industry, to simply employ another worker, increasing the number of hours worked, but not increasing the output at the same rate, than it was for them to properly invest in training staff. If you train staff properly, you can increase the output per hour much more. Well, it's the only way you can increase the output per hour, really. And so I think firms have made perhaps some slightly kind of short-termist decisions in terms of how they recruit staff rather than training existing staff. Having said that, the obvious corollary of that might be, you should employ less staff, but then, maybe productivity increases, but at the expense of unemployment also rising, which is effectively what has happened in France. So this is not an outcome that we would like. So I think what is more important is for firms to start thinking about investment in new technologies, which would allow workers to be more productive. That kind of investment requires also a commitment to training staff. There's no point in having new technologies if staff are not well prepared to use them. It seems to me that particularly as we move into a much more kind of artificial intelligence, automated age, there is a need for workers who maybe are in jobs that involve fairly, let's say, repetitive or monotonous tasks to be retrained to have a greater understanding of how machine learning works and so on. And there are some examples of very good practice in that field. Aviva is one place I would kind of highlight as someone that's thinking very seriously about these challenges. But firms need to invest much more in technology. They need to invest much more in skills. But I think they also need to think much more about staff morale and creating happier workers. We know that there's a lot of stress in the UK workplace. There are a lot of mental health kind of issues which are unresolved in the UK workplace. And firms need to get much more sensible and much more clued up about dealing with some of those issues.
Okay. And one of the factors in the recent slowdown in productivity is said to be something called total factor productivity. In manufacturing, for example, it's the reduction in capital spending, which may have been because of an increase in spending on employment. Now, that's good because it increases employment, but how do we move?
I don't necessarily think that sort of reasoning is correct. So, if the costs of employment are cheap, that actually makes capital more attractive because labour and capital complement each other. If you can hire lots of workers, it's because if you want to build a new machine, for instance, that machine is typically going to be used by someone. Now, if that worker, for instance, costs less, then that machine becomes a more profitable opportunity. So you'd expect low labour costs to encourage more investment, I think. And I think that's generally what you see where you have high rates of it, where investment and immigration seem to be tied to each other in a sense. So I don't know if I buy that argument completely. I think there are things we can do to increase the level of capital investment, though, in manufacturing. Key one is looking at the corporate tax system. So currently we have a corporate tax system where if you were to invest in a new machine, let's say you're, a big manufacturer, you're investing in a new steel processing machine. You bought that machine. Now, while if you bought a pen or your paper or whatever, you could write off that expense that year. For the large machine, you write it off for tax purposes over a number of years. So you could be waiting up 7 or 10 years, and to actually get the full tax benefit back. But that tax benefit will be worth less because of inflation, because of the fact that if you had that money then, you could have invested it. Well, that's why people borrow, or people charge interest rates on borrowing or charge interest rates on saving. So I think that would be the key reform, is to change that system so you would allow firms who were investing in new machinery to deduct that expense immediately. It's what's called full expensing. The US has brought it in for equipment and machinery for the next 5 years. My hope is that they extend it. But I think that's probably one of the easiest wins in terms of growth. And estimates generally suggest that of the whole tax reform in the US, that the full expensing measures are the ones that will lead to the biggest impact on growth.
So productivity growth in the UK is shown mainly through finance and through manufacturing and production. How can we encourage other industries to
Well,
grow?
I think you've got two things to do. First of all, expensing, as I've mentioned, making it easier to invest in capital machinery. Then I think the other thing is you have to look at the regional distortions. So people are much more productive in London than they are in Leeds. People are also much more productive in Slough than even they are in London, I believe, actually, if you look at the stats. So I think what you have to do is make it easier for people to move to the places where they're most productive. And that involves increasing housing supply. So that means building on things like the Green Belt, making it easier to build within cities. And I think that will make it cheaper to move to the places where you're most productive. I mean, you could be more productive in one city like London, but richer in another city after housing costs, because London rents are so high. And that is bad for the economy because you're earning less than you otherwise would be. But and I think that's one of the real problems, and that regional inefficiency is pretty substantive. In the US, Enrico Moretti and Chang Sai, I think I can't pronounce it correctly, I think, but the work of Enrico Moretti in particular, he's looked at the impact on growth of if the most restrictive regions were merely as restrictive as the median restrictiveness. And what he found was that, in general, that meant more people could have moved to San Francisco and New York, where they'd been more productive, and that would have given a substantial boost to GDP. We're looking at something in the magnitude of 10-13%, I believe, over a few decades. So there's a lot of growth being left on the table at the moment that we're not tapping into. And I think housing policy and tax policy are probably the biggest levers we can pull on.
In terms of the Green Belt, obviously
Green Belt, but also make it easy to build within cities, eventually moving to a Japanese-style zoning system that perhaps takes a bit more care for design codes at the same time, but something like that ultimately to build more houses, bring rents down as a result, and make it easier for people to move to where they're most productive.
Great. What was your opinion on the latest housing planning reforms, most recent reforms to planning regulations?
The national planning policy framework. Well, it's been, frankly, a bit of a disaster in a great many ways. I can see that some of it had probably positive intentions. Prior approval processes are the most obvious ones, where a kind of prior approval, i.e. that there is no requirement to obtain full planning permission to convert, let's say, for example, an office block into accommodation, is a way of hopefully creating more homes. The problem is that that prior approval process exists entirely outside of the planning system. So one can apply for a certificate, but you're not required to do so. It's just a way of kind of covering yourself to make sure that you're not breaching prior approval regulations. There's no requirement under prior approval for affordable housing contributions. And in fact, they simply don't occur, and so a lot of potential housing is lost. So if we take an urban area, the example of Reading might be instructive because it's the place I know best. We can see a lot of office blocks, often 1980s office blocks, which are no longer that desirable for companies. They want brand new offices. So somewhere like Reading, we see a lot of new offices being built and new companies moving in, often from London or some other area. And these older office blocks are being converted under prior approval into residential accommodation. The problem here is that this accommodation is often, to my mind, substandard. It is not good accommodation. The living space is too small. The amount of natural light is not good enough. The general aesthetic and amenity of the building is not up to scratch. And none of this is surprising. An office block built as an office block is unlikely to be readily convertible to high standard living accommodation. At the same time, many of these offices, when they're converted into flats for private rent, often at quite inflated prices, appealing to, for example, kind of student market or maybe young professionals. But they're not providing family homes, which is where there's the greatest need in urban areas. The greatest need is for 3-bedroom homes, 4-bedroom homes, but particularly those kind of 3-bedroom homes. And they're simply not being built under the prior approval process. And because there's no requirement to contribute to affordable housing, they're not being built any other way either. Similarly, prior approval doesn't require a developer to contribute to what we now call the community infrastructure levy. This means, in effect, that the infrastructure demands created by a new development, I think an office block, a sizable office block, could quite easily be turned into maybe 80 flats. So there could be a population in that building of, let's say, conservatively 120 people. So 120 new homes, but no upgrade to local infrastructure, no money to upgrade GP surgeries, the road network, schools, all of the healthcare, no money to upgrade all of those essential services. So to my mind, the national planning policy framework that the coalition government produced has been an appalling thing for Britain. In fact, it took a housing market that was creaking already simply because we weren't building as much, although we were building more back then than we are now, but it broke it completely. It's created a completely disjointed policy framework in which local authorities, developers and national government are trying to create homes for citizens but simply cannot. And so I think there has to be some very radical change in terms of the NPPF in order to make it fit for purpose and fit for the future. I think Labour's Housing Green Paper, which came out just a couple of months ago, thought about many of these issues and kind of made a lot of proposals, particularly in kind of strengthening the way in which affordable housing contributions are secured. And so there's a lot of good stuff there. But I think even Labour actually could think a bit further, perhaps in terms of further promotion of schemes like key worker housing to make sure that in areas, particularly in the southeast of England and London, where house prices are high and are likely to remain high even if we start building more tomorrow, the key workers, nurses, healthcare professionals, social care professionals, teachers are able to access affordable housing in particular areas.